So, good afternoon, everybody. For those who don't know me, and that wouldn't be very many in this room, I'm Philip O'Connell, Director of the Geary Institute here, and I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to give this paper about why so few Africans are at work in Ireland, focusing on immigration policy and labour market disadvantage. This is something that I've been working around for a number of years. I think it's probably fair to say that everybody knows that employment is absolutely crucial for both economic and social integration. Finding a job is also very important, not just in terms of making a contribution to the community, earning your living, but also making those essential social connections that mean that you integrate into the society. It has been observed numbers of times that Africans fare very poorly in the Irish labour market, and I'll show you some numbers on that in a minute. And so this paper I wrote was trying to figure out why that is the case. I do that by using a 10% sample of the census of population from 2011, but I also throw in a novel measure of exposure to the asylum system. And really, this is really quite a very simple little paper, and I've got one innovation, and so I'd like to get your reactions to what I've done in respect of that, because getting a sense for the impact of the asylum system on people's labour market outcomes has been very, very difficult to do, to establish any kind of evidence on the matter. This question of how Africans are doing in the labour market has been recently in the news. There was a report that came out from the ESRI. I was one of the authors on Monitoring Report on Integration in 2018, which showed, among other things, that Africans do very poorly in the Irish labour market in terms of employment and unemployment. Here's some numbers on the problem. So these are employment and unemployment rates measured in 2011 when our census is based. This is the Irish employment rate. It's just under 60%. You can see different groups. There's the Africans. So the Africans come in at about 44%. So only 44% of Africans in Ireland in 2011 are at work. You can also see the disadvantage reflected in the unemployment rates. In 2011, you've got an average unemployment rate among Irish people of just around 19%. Among UK people, it's over 20%. Among the Western European countries, it's about 12%. Africans, it's 35%. So there's clearly something going on. So there's something going on specifically that affects Africans in Irish society, and so I'm trying to chase that down and figure out what's going on. So when we ask the question, why do immigrants fare poorly in the labour market, I think you can think in terms of four different kinds of explanations. The first type of explanation is that it's got something to do with immigration itself, and there we go back to work by people like Barry Chiswick, who basically said that newcomers to the labour market, they don't have the connections, they don't have the social capital, they may not know how to get jobs and so on, so that it takes them a while to settle into a labour market. So that's why immigrants fare poorly. But then very quickly, others have come in to demonstrate that some groups fare better than others, and you can look, for example, at the work of Dustman and his colleagues in the UK, which shows that members of ethnic minority groups tend to do less well than people from other groups, even though they're all immigrants. So there's something going on there. And then you can also think in terms of pointing to different actors in the labour market. So the first one would be the individual immigrants themselves, and that points to the composition. And the answer there has something to do with there's something about the composition of immigrant groups. Is it because they're in economists' terms, lower quality, so lower levels of education, lower levels of experience, that could explain why some groups do worse than others. An alternative finger could be pointed at the state, and there you can think in terms of two aspects of state policy that organises the labour market as it happens for migrants. And here I guess you'd point to two dimensions. I mean, the first one would be managed migration, and here I guess a summary of managed migration policies in Ireland would be that after EU enlargement, Ireland basically decided that it would solve its labour market needs and labour shortages from within the EU, because we have free travel across the EU, and it would reserve the solution to skills difficulties to outside the EU. And so basically what that means is that if you come from outside of the EU, by and large you need to get an employment permit, and you have to demonstrate that there's a skill need or a skill shortage that you're you're satisfying. And so that's going to structure the experience of the labour market for immigrants in Ireland. And it's going to mean that there's going to be a difference between EU people, who will look a lot like Irish people, and everybody else from outside of the EU. And then there are asylum policies, and I'll go into this in more detail, but effectively the key factor here is that asylum seekers in Ireland up to very, very recently were excluded from the labour market, and therefore that's going to have an impact on their labour market behaviour and outcomes. And then there's pointing not to the state or to the individual, but to the activities of employers. And here the suspicion is that employers may discriminate for various reasons against immigrants or against particular groups of immigrants. And so that can also show up as differential labour market outcomes. So that's a sort of a quick tour through the kinds of explanations we look for. We can also look at what's been done in previous Irish research, and I've just put up a few samplers on the board. I guess we could go back to 2008 and some work I did with Fran McGinnity that showed first that non-nationals are more likely to be unemployed than nationals, and that was using labour force survey data. But we also found that black Africans in particular were most likely to be unemployed compared to any other group in the Irish labour market. We can look at Alan Barrett and David Duffy's work from around the same time, looking at immigrants, and they also showing that immigrants from particular countries, and particularly the new states, had the lowest occupational attainment. So again, the argument is that it's not just all immigrants, it's something about different groups of immigrants are faring differently. We can look at other work from myself, Ailish Kelly, Jill Kingston, that came out in 2013, showing that black Africans suffer severe labour market disadvantage compared to all other groups, but they're also more likely to experience or to report the experience of discrimination. So when asked, black Africans were telling us that they were much more likely to have experienced discrimination in getting access to work than other groups. And we can also look at other work. Fran McGinnity and Pete Lund did some work back in 2011 with some field experiments looking at the experience of discrimination. And what they found was that when they sent out a bunch of responses to job ads, keeping everything constant in terms of qualifications and so on, but distinguishing between obvious names, they discovered that Africans, Asians and Germans were a good deal less likely to be called for interview than people with obviously Irish names. And so they were pointing to a very clear discrimination against immigrants, although interestingly, they didn't find any differences between the groups. So Africans, Germans and Asians were all experiencing the same level of discrimination in this field experiment. And then there's other evidence that comes from more qualitative approaches. There's the work of Lucy Michael, which came out a couple of years ago, which focuses on online self-reporting system reports of abuse and racial abuse of Africans at work. So this is somewhat different in the sense that this is looking at Africans in the workplace rather than Africans getting difficulty with access to the labour market. But again, they're pointing to Africans being treated differently in an Irish context. I mentioned the Irish asylum system because one of the key objectives in this paper is to try and assess whether the asylum system is having an impact on labour market outcomes. So just to give you a quick introduction, asylum seekers are awaiting decisions on their applications for refugee status since about 2001 have been accommodated collectively in direct provision centres scattered around the country. They received small allowances in 2011 when the data we're looking at was available. That was €19.10 per adult. It was much, much smaller for children. Crucially, they were denied the right to work in Ireland, and that remained the case up until earlier this year. So effectively what that meant was that many Africans spend extended periods of time in direct provision. Many of them spend periods of up to 3 or 5 years in direct provision, excluded from the economy, and therefore the notion is that this would scar their employment chances. There's a good deal of research that shows that extended periods of unemployment scar your future employment prospects, not just immediately, but over the long haul. Just to give you the context for the research, so the timing is 2011. We're in the depths of the Great Recession. GDP had contracted by about a fifth between 2007 at the peak of the boom and 2010. There was very little going on in terms of growth in 2011. Employment fell by 13% between 2007 and 2011, but crucially, it fell by 21% among non-nationals. So the non-nationals were particularly hard hit by the recession. But the economic collapse led to migratory outflows or migratory flows in both directions. So a lot of people left during the recession, but that was offset by a significant amount of people coming in again with different kinds of skills. So even in 2011, right in the depths of the recession, inward migration was 53,000, and that included just under 1,300 asylum seekers. So an important side note is that always, if you look at Irish immigration statistics, notwithstanding a good deal of noise about it, asylum seekers generally have accounted for about 2.5% of the total migratory inflow. So they're a very small part of the overall migration story in an Irish context. Just to get a sense for the scale of the thing, non-Irish population was just under 13% in 2008 and was just over 12% in 2011. So those flows of population meant that the non-national population actually pretty much held up right through the depths of a recession. Okay, moving to data, and I guess at this point I should acknowledge Piers Parker, who was the key person who helped me with all the data analysis. We got the data from the Integrated Public Use Microdata series from the Minnesota Population Center. If you haven't looked at it, I would strongly urge you to do so. It's a very, very easy way to get your hands on microdata, and you can actually get the data onto your own machine. So the microdata is a 10% sample of the population. The advantage then is you've got big numbers, and that means that you can track relatively small populations, subpopulations. The disadvantage, of course, is that you've got a very, very small number of variables that you can play with. So here we've got country of birth, age, sex, marital status, number of children, education. They've got English fluency, which is a definite bonus because many studies of immigrants in the labour market don't actually measure language fluency. And then we've got something about the time of arrival in Ireland. It's the immigration decade, so it's the decade of immigration. And this is just to give you some descriptors from the data. And so you can see that people from Ireland, in terms of region of birth, accounted for 82.5% of the population. And these then are the non-Irish regions of birth. Africans accounted for 5,500 cases in the data set, and 1.2% of the data set. Okay, back then to our outcomes. We're interested in two outcomes, employment and unemployment. And in order to render everybody more or less comparable, we've reduced the population to the 25 to 64 year age group. So we're looking at people who are in the labour market or likely to be in the labour market. And here again we look at the employment rate, but this time we're going to distinguish between male and female. You can see, again, if we take the Irish people as the dominant largest group, about 60% of males are in employment in 2011, about 55% of females. And then look at the Africans, 50% of male Africans, only 37% of female applicants at work in 2011. And they're clearly the most disadvantaged in terms of access to work in 2011. We can also look at unemployment rate, again differentiating by gender. Average unemployment among Irish people is over 20%. This is principal economic status rather than the more familiar ILO-based measure that we see in the labour force survey. And so it's a somewhat looser definition of unemployment. So the overall levels are a little bit higher. But I don't think we've got any reason to suspect that they're going to differ between groups. It's just that the overall level is a little higher. African unemployment is sky high. So among men, it's about 33%. Among women, it's about 37%. So again, they stand out very much from the rest of the other groups that we're interested in the data. So clearly, there's a clear disadvantage going on. So then we start thinking about, well, where is that coming from? So the first thing we might think to do is look at education. And here's just a description of education by region of birth. And what we find here is that about 45% of Africans have a third level qualification. So they're a relatively well-educated group. In fact, they're a better educated group than the Irish, of whom 30% have third level qualification. So if it's education you're looking at, that's not part of the story. Here's age group. And so we're looking at different ages. And so if you think in terms of the prime working age, 2 25 to 54 would be pretty much the age groups in which you'd expect to find people at work. 78% of Africans are at work. And again, they would compare favourably with Western Europeans and other groups who have high employment rates, but the Africans don't have high employment rates. So we still haven't nailed down an explanation for why they differ so much from the rest of the population. So we're going to move into a multivariate framework. And here I've got a series of logistic regressions for males and for females. And the difference between this model and this model is that in this model, I just plug in the country effects and show the odds ratios. And you can see that in this case, Africans are substantially less likely to be at work. They're much lower odds than Irish people. And interestingly enough, when we control for a range of variables, and that includes controlling for age, marriage, children, education, English language, and immigration, the African effect not only doesn't go away, it actually intensifies. And so that's telling us that when we compare like for like, Africans are actually doing worse than you would expect them to do on the basis of their personal characteristics and these variables that we've controlled for. We find the same sort of process in relation to females, although the reduction is not quite so much. But basically what this is telling us is that when you control for all of the kinds of explanations that people typically look for when they're looking at labour market performance, that African men's odds of being employed are well less than half, and African females' chances of being employed are about half those of an equivalent Irish person. Now, it's useful to think in terms of the control variables. I always do this just to make sure that the models are well behaved, but there are some interesting substantive effects as well. First off, and this is from the overall run, so this is mostly driven by the large group of Irish people, but married men are more likely to be at work than single men. That's true for females as well, but not to the same extent. Number of children has a positive effect. Then in terms of ages, really the big one there is that once people hit 55, they reduce their work rates. So you can see much smaller odds ratios here and here for men and women. Education has a big impact. So a man with a third level education is about 4 times more likely than a man with a lower than secondary education to be employed. And then we throw in some migration related variables. Here's some relative to speaking English very well. Here's the effect of speaking English well. So that reduces the odds of being employed for both men and women, about the same. And speaking English not well or not at all, so that reduces their odds of being at work to about half those of an equivalent Irish an equivalent person who has good English. So English language skills are very, very important in terms of your labour market prospects. We also have that variable immigrated after 2001 versus everybody else who had either immigrated before or was part of the indigenous population. And that also has a negative impact for both men and women on their employment chances. Okay, so far we've looked at fairly standard explanations in terms of the composition of the different groups, and we found that there are differences remaining between Africans in particular and everybody else, even when we control for all of these variables.
Phil?
Yeah.
So one thing is sometimes qualifications of immigrants are not, depending on where they're from, not recognised by employers. You could, I don't know if you've done this, interact, say, education with place of birth, continent. In other words, does an African with a degree get treated the same as an Irish person with a degree?
Okay. I haven't done that. It would be interesting to look at it.
Yeah, it'd be easy enough to do.
I mean, the interaction seemed like the logical next step. I mean, you've shown the control variables, okay? Mm-hmm. I mean, implicit, I presume, in the argument you're developing is that the returns on these key control variables, like education, are different depending on the nationality. Now, I think as Kevin is pointing out, there could be a couple of reasons for that. There could be a discrimination type effect, or it could be the qualifications are not quite the same. But either way,
it would be interesting to do the interactions, yeah. Okay.
Particularly because on your first slide there on the nationalities, nationality is on its own is explaining almost nothing. It's the R squared, and I know that R squared's in logistic learning, but it's 0.002.
Yeah.
That, again, it might be different if you ran the Africans against everybody else.
Yeah.
But I suspect it probably wouldn't be.
Okay. That would certainly be interesting. Yeah. Okay. Let me continue, and I'll come back to that because I'm wondering whether it's going to have an impact on what I'm going to do next. So far, as I said, we've been looking at fairly standard explanations for differential outcomes in the labour market. And then I wanted to try and get some sense for the impact of the asylum system, which I think is having a scarring effect on Africans in particular and Asians to an extent, because they're the main people you find in the direct provision centres. So what I did was, and of course, we don't actually have any way of measuring whether somebody is either now or has ever been in the past a part of the asylum system, because that is data that's not collected in the census or the labour force survey or anything. So I created a new variable, and what the variable is the ratio of the numbers of people seeking asylum. In this case, it's in the years 2008 to 2010. So I picked that up from Eurostat data, which is so the Irish authorities report very carefully the numbers of asylum seekers in their countries by country of birth. Sorry, by nationality. And then I expressed that as a ratio to the population that I measured in the census. So each individual, therefore, has a ratio associated with them, which is their risk of having been in the asylum system based on the number of asylum seekers from their country that have been through the system in the previous 3 years, and it's averaged. And so this is just some descriptives on the measure. So not surprisingly, EU is 0, so we don't have any asylum seekers from EU countries. Africa, the average is 2.7 for men, 3.1 for men, 2.3 for women. That's 2.7% on average of people from the African region have claimed asylum. It's sky high in Congo, 14.6, and it's particularly high for men, 16.2. Asia is lower than Africa, but you have Afghanistan with 17.6, overall 21% among men. So 21% is the population or the asylum to population ratio. So the notion is that this captures the risk of exposure to the asylum system. So then let's see what happens if we plug this into my logistic regression equations. And so I've got the individual controls that you've seen in the previous, and then I add the asylum population ratio. So I think there are two things to observe here. First is the asylum population ratio. So the asylum population ratio is clearly having a significant a negative effect for men. And remember, this is now a ratio variable rather than a dummy variable. So one way to think about it is to dichotomize. And if you were to think in terms of men who have a 5% chance of being in the asylum system, that would reduce their employment odds in Ireland down to half compared to an Irish person. So while this doesn't look particularly large, when you actually translate it into a high risk of being in the asylum system, you have a high chance, it has a very significant negative impact on your employment chances. The same for women, although that's at the margins of statistical significance. I guess the other thing to point out would be that when we plug in the asylum to population ratio, some of the African disadvantage is explained, or it's reduced by the addition of the asylum to population ratio. So in respect of men, the odds ratio comes up from about 4 to about 5.7. Among women, it's not quite as large, but you still get this attenuation of the national effects. We also see a similar sort of process in relation to Asia, but not to the same extent. And of course, Africans and Asians are the ones who are most likely to find themselves in the asylum system in Ireland. Now, I've done effectively that's the same one. Sorry, I've done effectively the same analysis using unemployment. Remember, we saw that Africans are particularly likely to be unemployed. So here's the models with individual characteristics, and that's controlling for age, education, marriage, English language, time of immigration, and so on. So African men are about 2.5 times more likely than the reference category, Irish men, to be unemployed, and African women are more than 3.5 times more likely than their equivalent Irish females to be unemployed. So then we plug in the asylum to population ratio, and so what we're finding here is that, if you like, mirroring the employment models, the asylum population ratio increases your likelihood of being unemployed for both males and females. In the case of the females, a woman who's got a more than 4% asylum to population ratio will have 2.5 times the odds of being unemployed compared to someone who's in a lower risk category for asylum to population. Again, we also see that the effect of the African dummy variable is attenuated by the addition of the asylum to population ratio. So again, this is helping to explain part of this severe disadvantage. It's due to the yeah.
So you've got a dummy variable for somebody's continent, and then you have an additional dummy variable for the asylum population ratio for their specific country, yeah?
No, that's a ratio variable.
Am I misinterpreting? Pardon?
That's a race. The asylum population is a ratio variable rather than a dummy.
Oh, okay, but it's specific to the country
Yes.
that you're picking up. So
Yeah.
are you picking up a country fixed effect, or are you picking up an asylum population effect?
So it doesn't vary by country.
No.
Each individual from the Congo will have the same measure here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm confused as to what you're picking up. Is there some kind of mixing together of an asylum effect and a country effect? You know, if you instead of did it by Africa, suppose you did it by just by countries,
Yeah.
right? And could you separately identify a country effect from an asylum population effect?
No, because the measures would be identical then.
Yeah, yeah. So how do you know that what you're picking up isn't a country effect?
Because I got variation on asylum population ratio.
That's kind of contra. I will look at it. I don't want to dwell on it.
Okay.
You
You can mull on it rather than dwell on it, because I think that's the crucial question about whether this is a valid approach or not. So we've arrived at conclusions. So I mean, the first very obvious conclusion is that the African disadvantage is not due to composition. Africans are well educated, many of them in the prime working age. And the models show that controlling for individual characteristics actually intensifies the estimated disadvantage. The models also show that the odds of Irish men being employed are about twice those of African-born men with similar characteristics. The odds of African-born women being unemployed are 3.5 times those of equivalent Irish-born women. Now, some of the African disadvantage seems to be due to the policy of excluding asylum seekers from the labour market. I think the asylum population ratio captures exposure to the asylum system. It is effectively a risk variable for being in the asylum system. And the asylum risk reduces unemployment and increases unemployment odds. So a man from a country with a 5% asylum population ratio has half the employment odds of a man with a lower risk, and so on, and similar for females. And I think that's likely to be a conservative estimate of the true impact of the asylum system, because we're only talking about people's risks of being in the asylum system at any individual level rather than having experienced it or not. Including the asylum risk variable reduces the effects of region of birth, particularly among Africans and Asians, and they're the ones who are most likely to be found in the direct provision centres and to be so excluded from the labour market. But, and there's an important but, and that is that there's still a large residual disadvantage for Africans, and that may be due to discrimination. And we say that on the basis of the previous research that I pointed to on the introduction. There's an epilogue. In May 2017, a Burmese man who'd been 8 years in direct provision won a Supreme Court appeal against the ban on working. More than a year later, the government came back and announced that asylum seekers would be allowed to work from 9 months after their asylum application if they had not received a first instance decision and have not appealed. And that, of course, is quite a restrictive allowance, because it means that anybody who has appealed or who hasn't yet had their case considered doesn't have access to the labour market. So several hundred people have applied for work, and we will, it'll be very, very interesting to see what the effects of that are on their employment prospects. So that's my lot, and I would very welcome comments.